I can start right now, I guess. Okay, so at the end of the day, the many lines of evidence supporting human genetic degeneration in and of itself strongly indicates that ape to man evolution is literally impossible. Why? Because the direction of change is always and has been downward, never upward. Human degeneration is amazingly consistent with the biblical perspective, with a perfect created couple, specifically Adam and Eve, of course, a literal fall, and a decaying human population. The fact that scientific evidence, empirical scientific evidence, has proven that man has not evolved from an ape-like ancestor is enough in and of itself to show the validity of Genesis. For example, genetics alone, in regards to similarities, the evolutionists will say human to chimpanzee genetic identity is 98 to 99% similar, but the fact is, based on many lines of evidence, it's only about 88% similar, but that's over 400 million DNA differences that exist between the two species. They would use nested hierarchies. The fact that humans are genetically closer to apes than to other animal species, that doesn't demonstrate common ancestry, though, because relative hierarchies, they're characteristics of design. They love to use human chromosome number 2 that they say arose through 2 ape-like chromosomes, but that purported fusion site is actually a functional DNA element in a human gene. They'll look to shared genetic mistakes, or what Adam might understand as pseudogenes, but these pseudogenes now appear to be functional DNA elements and not mistakes. I can go on and on and on, but that's just a few. Let's really get into the evidence, though. Absolute evidence for Adam, Eve, and Noah. Adam, Eve, and Noah versus modern genetics. Atheists act surprised when they hear that there is overwhelming evidence for a literal Adam and Eve who lived just thousands of years ago. Genetics confirms biblical history. All the actual evidence that we actually have proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that all of humanity descended from one single female and one single male ancestor just thousands of years ago. Also, today we have low genetic diversity, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that humanity is young and proving that we all came from just 2 people. There's no evidence that there were many other people alive prior to or during that time. There was no bottleneck, even in the geologic column 200,000 years ago. So that cherry-picked rescue device is gone and will not help my evolutionary opponent here. There was no logical explanation to think that the supposed 9,999 other women only had male children, nor is it logical to conclude that the other 9,999 men all died, not leaving a trace at all. And what happened to all the supposed humans before these 2? There is no answer to this because it's all ad hoc reasoning. Finally, it is also not logical to conclude that primitive man went into a bottleneck and modern day man came out. Literally every single rescuing device the evolutionists use to fight against the actual observed evidence is worse than the last. There are 3 main events in Scripture, specifically in Genesis, which I am defending, that we can address with modern genetics. The events are the creation of Adam and Eve, the flood of Noah, and the Tower of Babel. Now, over deep time, any large population will accumulate enormous numbers of mutations, resulting in enormous amounts of genetic diversity. This is a very serious problem for evolutionary theory because it is now clear and evident that mankind has very limited genetic variation, as I touched on earlier. While the observed low genetic diversity is a massive problem from the evolutionary perspective, this is most certainly expected and predicted from the biblical perspective. If you only started with 2 people, obviously, what does that do? It restricts the diversity today. From the biblical model, we all come from just 2 people. This obviously means that limited diversity is easy to explain, and the Bible predicted this. What does this mean? The death and demise of the evolutionary bottleneck theory and the evolutionary out of Africa theory. It's just too close for comfort for evolutionists. All human beings are profoundly similar genetically, and this points directly to Adam and Eve, which is the title and the topic of the debate today. Evidence that confirms Adam and Eve. It is now clear and evident that there exists a singular female ancestor of all humans, which is referred to as mitochondrial Eve, and her basic DNA sequence is easily discernible and detected in humans alive today and is not more similar to a chimpanzee. There is also clearly and evidently a singular male ancestor of all humans alive today, referred to and known as Y chromosome Adam. His DNA sequence is largely known, and contrary to what evolutionists believe, it is not at all similar to that of chimpanzees. For example, mitochondrial Eve is very literally the mother of us all. The small number of mutations that separate modern people from the sequence of mitochondrial Eve indicate strongly that mitochondrial Eve lived in the recent past. Now, evolutionists, of course, have rescue devices. But at the end of the day, when we use observed mutation rates, the empirical process, it confirms biblical creation. All these findings are strong evidence supporting the literal Adam of the Bible. More reasons why Adam and Eve were historical. The Bible, for one, refers to them as historical. That's documentary evidence. Jesus believed they were historical. Was Jesus lying? Paul believed they were historical, the church fathers and the reformers. I'm mainly utilizing genetics here, but we can go many different routes. Just look at Noah's flood. This story tells us that all people should be closely related. It tells us there should only be a few mitochondrial DNA lines as Shem, Ham, and Japheth's wives. And only one Y chromosome, since it's only Noah. His 3 sons would have inherited his Y chromosome, of course. And we should have significant evidence of rapid population growth. It turns out that this, too, is exactly what we find in modern genetics. This did not all have to be true. The Tower of Babel account. We have found a single dispersal of all people in the relatively recent past, traveling in small people groups into uninhabited territory through the Middle East. What do they call it? The Out of Africa story. But these are all biblical-based predictions. Evolutionary rescue devices are dead. The evolutionary bottleneck hypothesis that involves an extended and lengthy near extinction event is a fairy tale. This failed hypothesis is associated with severe inbreeding. It is not even remotely feasible. Evolutionists hope, dream, and imagine. Therefore, from the evolutionary perspective and the evolutionary fairy tale, human genetic homogeneity remains a very serious theoretical problem. Let's look at this visually. I want to point out the fact that these lines all come back to a common origin in basically 3 different common groupings. If you're looking at this mitochondrial map here, there was also subgroups. This is not a point of dispute, as even the evolutionists themselves recognize this fact. We call these in technical terms the 3 major haplogroups, L, M, and N. This is standard evolutionary science and belief. I am defending biblical creation here. And therefore, when we look at this mitochondrial map, what is the maternal ancestry of the human population? Well, we start with Adam and Eve, who then have many children. We move quickly here to the time of the flood. And how many female lineages survive the flood? Well, there's Noah and his wife. Noah's wife passes on mitochondrial DNA. We talked about mitochondrial DNA earlier. It's inherited exclusively from women. She passes this on to her sons, but it stops there. Noah's 3 sons obviously do not pass on their mitochondrial DNA, but their 3 wives do. And so we trace back to 3 women. And what's astounding is that we see these 3 major groups. It's remarkable that we can then identify these 3 major haplogroups as the wives of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. What's remarkable as well is the relative pattern, as we know that DNA differences are a marker of time. And they're a marker of thousands of years, not hundreds of thousands of years, as the evolutionists would have you believe. And so how many generations were pre-flood and how many were post-flood are very important questions to ask. Reading Genesis, we know that on the paternal side, there were about 1,600 years or 10 generations or so, consisting of very long lifespans, where we actually see the lifespans dropping off quite rapidly post-flood. And so we probably got a couple hundred generations post-flood. Therefore, we see very little time for mutation pre-flood and longer branches post-flood, indicating more generations and more differences, more mutations. The mutations would also explain the long African branches, which you can see here. We have a few potential explanations. Africans could undergo a faster rate of change, or even an explanation involving UN data in the 70s that tells us women on average in Africans married early, whereas the rest of the globe not so much. If this was true historically, Africans would have gone through twice as many, maybe even 3 times as many generations and therefore mutations than non-Africans. How much more time do I have there, Matt?
2.5 minutes.
2.5 minutes. They do have criticisms. I've debated Dr. Stephen Frell. I've debated lots of evolutionists on this, and they've got no real rebuttal. I'm going to put this to bed. L, M, and N are too close together. They'll say that M and N came from L. Don't you know this, standing for truth? Well, they're too close together with few genetic differences separating them. So to say M, N came from L is only in theory and based on evolutionary assumptions, because their base, L, is located in South Africa, while it should be located near the border of the Middle East and Africa. L, M, and N can also be all three linked together, regardless which came from which, because the three at or near the center of genetic diversity worldwide. What does this mean? It means we came from L, M, and N. Whether L, M, and N together or L producing M and N, it's a worldview thing. But the most important thing to be taken from this is that the map makes testable predictions. They flow from the placement of the root. This is specifically related to mitochondrial DNA. For example, the mutation rate in the most divergent of African people groups, the Khoisan peoples. Where are the predictions from the evolutionists? They don't exist. Genetic entropy, as I touched on in the beginning, the biblical-based model predicts death, degeneration, and extinction after the fall. This is exactly what we see, all consistent. The created heterozygosity hypothesis, which we can get into as well, based on the biblical story and account of the biblical kinds in Adam and Eve, makes testable predictions on DNA function. How much longer, Matt?
1 minute, go ahead.
Well, real quick, genetically, it goes back to this idea of big A, little a, big B, little b. If Adam and Eve were created genetically homogeneous with no variety in their DNA, all capital letters or all lowercase letters, then yes, it would be difficult to create variety in just a few thousand years. And this goes for the kinds of animals God created. Adam and Eve and these kinds with capital A, lowercase a, capital B, lowercase b. And you do that for the millions of DNA positions that exist. That means they have the potential to produce all sorts of variety in just a single generation. We've now got multiple lines of evidence indicating that this was the case, that God created Adam and Eve and the kinds in the beginning, so they have the potential within themselves to produce all sorts of variety. In the case of animal kinds, all sorts of species. You know what some would call an evolutionary heartbeat. I can go on and on about this model for sake of time. It's not ad hoc because it makes predictions on speciation rates, mutation rates, DNA function, and more. We can get more into that later. Thank you so much for watching the presentation, and thank you so much, gentlemen, for listening.